Welcome to Starlight Sci-Fi, where we explore the wonders and chaos of the universe one story at a time. In a universe where peace teetered on a knife's edge, one act shattered centuries of fragile diplomacy. It wasn't a fleet of starships or a planet-destroying weapon, but something far simpler and far deadlier, a sword. The Unity Spire was a marvel of galactic engineering. Suspended in orbit around a dying red supergiant, its translucent walls shimmered with an ethereal glow, casting prismatic light across the endless void. For centuries, the station had been a neutral ground for interstellar diplomacy, a sanctuary where enemies met to trade words instead of weapons. Today, it played host to the most important gathering in galactic history, the signing of the Pact of Eternal Accord. 37 species, each with their own distinct biology, cultures, and histories, were represented in the Spire's Grand Assembly Hall. Towering crystalline obrins stood beside the multi-limbed, insectoid Krinther, while the amorphous, jelly-like cricks floated silently in containment fields. Yet, despite the diversity of life forms, there was a shared air of tension. Suspicion lingered in every glance, doubt in every movement. Among the delegates stood High Chancellor Mira Falk, humanity's chosen representative. Compared to the other species, humans were newcomers to the galactic stage. Only 300 years had passed since their first contact with the Kylorans, a psychic species who had once dismissed humanity as primitive and inconsequential. But humans had defied expectations. Their rapid adaptation to advanced technology, their resilience in the face of hostile worlds, and their determination to carve out a place among the stars had earned them respect and fear. Falk embodied the spirit of her people. Clad in a formal uniform with Earth's crest proudly displayed, she stood no taller than the knee of the towering Zul'kar warlord across the room. Yet, her presence commanded attention. Her steel-gray eyes scanned the hall, observing every detail, every movement. For humanity, this treaty was more than a diplomatic milestone. It was a chance to prove their worth and secure their survival. The Grand Assembly Hall was a breathtaking arena, its vaulted ceiling encrusted with crystals that mirrored the dying star's crimson light. A circular table at its center bore holographic projections of the galaxy, each planet glowing faintly with the color of its ruling species. Delegates took their places, their voices subdued as the ceremony began. But the sense of hope that had brought them together quickly began to falter. The Zul'kar delegation, led by the infamous warlord Tyranny, arrived late and unannounced. Their entrance was anything but subtle. Clad in heavy armor and flanked by armed soldiers, they exuded menace. Though weapons were strictly forbidden in the Spire, the Zul'kar warlord openly carried an energy scythe, a brazen display of defiance. The other delegates murmured uneasily, but Arkat's predatory grin showed he relished the fear his presence invoked. Falk watched him closely, her expression unreadable. Humanity had fought fiercely against Zul'kar forces in the Spiral Wars, and Falk knew better than to trust them. Yet she held her composure, determined not to let her suspicions cloud the opportunity for peace. The ceremony commenced, but the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing moment. As the opening speeches were delivered, whispers of unease rippled through the chamber. Allies exchanged worried glances, their body language betraying their doubts. The dream of peace, so tantalizingly close, felt fragile, like a thread on the verge of snapping. Falk remained silent, her gaze fixed on the holographic galaxy before her. Somewhere deep in her gut, she felt an ominous sense that this day would not end as planned. For humanity and for the galaxy, the stakes were about to rise higher than anyone could have imagined. The first cracks in the alliance appeared slowly, like subtle tremors before a great earthquake. The Unity Spire, a beacon of hope for those seeking lasting peace, was now becoming a pressure cooker of mistrust. It started with a simple exchange of words, a raised voice, and a glance that lingered a moment too long. But the tension soon boiled over, threatening to undo everything the treaty had promised. The Kyloran delegation, composed of highly intellectual beings with sophisticated psychic abilities, had been one of the strongest supporters of the pact. Their serene faces, all perfectly synchronized, were now contorted with unease. As they listened to the Zul'kar representative speak, the air around them seemed to crackle with latent power. A subtle shift in their mental energy made the hairs on the back of Falk's neck stand up. She had been trained to read people, to sense when something wasn't right, and it was clear that the Kylorans were beginning to falter. The first accusations came quietly, almost in passing, during a formal session on the security provisions of the treaty. One of the Kyloran emissaries, a high-ranking diplomat named Nevok, mentioned in an offhanded comment that they had noticed strange energy patterns near the station's outer hull. Nevok, his features impossibly smooth and almost featureless, spoke with an air of cool certainty, claiming that these fluctuations were similar to the energy signatures used by the Zul'kar's warships when they were in stealth mode. At first, the room reacted with skepticism. The Zul'kar had arrived under official terms, and any suggestion of dishonesty seemed unfounded. But Nevok's voice carried an unsettling certainty, one that made even the most seasoned diplomats pause. His accusation was not made lightly. It was not the usual political posturing. Something about the way he spoke made the air feel heavier. Falk leaned forward, her mind racing. The Kyloran were not ones to make baseless claims, especially during such a delicate negotiation. The suspicion in Nevok's voice wasn't paranoia. It was the chilling certainty of someone who had witnessed something unsettling firsthand. She tried to maintain her composure, but the tension in the room was palpable. The Zul'kar delegation reacted swiftly. Their warlord, Arkath Shrine, dismissed the claims with a low, guttural laugh that reverberated through the chamber. His massive, reptilian eyes narrowed as he stood from his seat, towering over everyone else. The threat was clear in his posture, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his energy scythe. Your Kyloran psychic tricks will not intimidate me, Arkath's voice boomed. Such accusations are the games of weaklings, not those who rule the stars. The Kyloran stiffened, their psychic shields pulsing in response. But instead of retreating, they pressed forward. Nevok, never one to be cowed, claimed that his people had intercepted high-level communications from a Zul'kar outpost on the edge of the galaxy. According to the intercepted messages, an ambush fleet was being prepared, poised to strike at any time. The room went silent. Every eye turned to the Zul'kar, who stood unmoving, their expressions unreadable. For a moment it seemed as though they might concede the accusation. But then, just as quickly, the silence broke into laughter from Arkath's entourage. The warlord himself turned to the council with a smug grin. Preposterous, he sneered. Your accusations are based on outdated information. There is no fleet. There never was. But even as Arkath spoke, Falk couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. The Kylorans were not known for making false claims, and if they had intercepted such a communication, it meant the Zul'kar were lying just as they always had. Before anyone could respond, a loud, shrill alarm rang out across the spire. The lights flickered as the station's emergency systems kicked into gear. Panic spread like wildfire. The assembly hall plunged into chaos. Security teams rushed to the doors, but their radios crackled with garbled transmissions. The alarms intensified. Then came the first explosion, shaking the very foundations of the spire. It wasn't just the station's systems that were under attack. The blast had crippled the outer defenses. Energy shields, once impenetrable, flickered and sputtered, leaving the spire vulnerable to outside threats. Falk's heart raced as she watched the monitors in horror. The Zul'kar had known. They had planned this all along. As the spire's defenses faltered, the truth became undeniable. They had just entered a galactic conspiracy, and the treaty was nothing more than a trap. As the alarms blared and panic set in, Falk realized that the dream of peace was slipping away faster than anyone could stop it. The universe was on the brink of war again, and this time, humanity might be forced to fight alone. The initial explosion had been only the beginning. The Unity Spire, once a symbol of unity and peace, now groaned under the weight of betrayal. It was as if the delicate web of trust holding the galaxy together had been ripped apart in a single, fiery instant. The devastation spread like wildfire, the shock waves from the blast tearing through the spire's inner corridors and causing havoc across its many levels. Falk's mind raced. The explosion wasn't just a random act of sabotage. It was an orchestrated strike meant to cripple their entire diplomatic summit. The once pristine holographic images of the galaxy, which had projected unity and hope moments earlier, flickered and distorted as the station's power systems faltered. The walls shook, and the lights dimmed to an eerie glow. "Lock down the perimeter." Falk barked to her security team, but her words were drowned out by the growing cacophony of alarms. As her command reverberated through the chaos, she fought to keep her composure. The Kyloran emissaries, who had been silent throughout the explosion, exchanged anxious glances. They seemed to be scanning the room, using their psychic abilities to search for any answer, as to who had done this, and why. Nevok, the Kyloran diplomat, who had first raised suspicions about the Zul'kar, stepped forward with an unnervingly calm expression. His psychic powers were already probing the airwaves, trying to make sense of the rapidly deteriorating situation. Falk knew that the Kyloran's ability to read minds and manipulate thoughts was unmatched. But in this moment, their talents seemed useless. The attack had come too fast and too decisively. There was no time for subtlety, no time for peace. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the emergency channels. The station's chief engineer, Lieutenant Kale, sounded out of breath but resolute. "The explosion damaged the core stabilizers. The outer hull is compromised. We've lost contact with the outer defense grid. There's a fleet approaching." Falk's heart skipped a beat. She had known that the Zul'kar were ruthless, but this was a calculated assault on everything the galaxy had worked toward. The betrayal, so carefully concealed beneath the layers of diplomatic civility, was now exposed for all to see. The Zul'kar were not here to negotiate, they had come to finish what they had started in the Spiral Wars. The Kylorans, ever perceptive, began to speak in hurried whispers among themselves. Their psychic powers allowed them to communicate without words, sharing thoughts and fears in rapid succession. Their conclusions were clear. The Zul'kar were not just responsible for the explosion, they had set the trap in motion, using the treaty as a facade. As panic spread through the hall, the once proud alliance of species began to fracture. Some delegates, fearing the worst, made a beeline for the emergency escape pods. Others moved toward the communication terminals, attempting to reach their home fleets for reinforcements. The tension was palpable, thickening the air as each species made its own calculations. Would they stay and fight? Would they flee? The very idea of unity, once so powerful, was crumbling before their eyes. And through it all, Arkat's shrine remained silent. The Zul'kar warlord had not moved since the explosion. His reptilian eyes scanned the room, cold and calculating. His soldiers, positioned near the exits, stood at the ready, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. The threat was clear. He was not here to negotiate peace. The treaty had been a diversion, a well-crafted illusion meant to disarm the galaxy's leaders before he struck. Falk's instincts screamed at her to act. But the question now was whether she could rally enough support to do anything meaningful before the Zul'kar unleashed their full might. With the Spire's defenses down, they were sitting ducks in the middle of hostile space. She glanced at the other delegates. Some were already surrendering, giving in to fear, while others scrambled to formulate desperate plans of escape. But Falk didn't have time for such hesitation. The attack had revealed the true nature of the situation. The galaxy was no longer teetering on the edge of peace, it was plummeting toward war. Humanity had no choice but to rise, to fight, and to prove once again that they would not go down without a struggle. She turned to the Kylorans, her resolve hardening. It was clear that their psychic powers, while formidable, would not be enough to face down the Zul'kar threat alone. But perhaps, just perhaps, if they joined forces with the other species who still had the will to fight, they could survive this onslaught. The enemy had made their move. Now it was time for humanity to respond. The chaos in the Unity Spire grew more intense with each passing moment. The once pristine halls designed to inspire trust and cooperation now echoed with the frantic sounds of panic. Security teams scrambled to restore order, while delegates clashed with one another, torn between the instinct to flee and the desire to confront the threat head-on. The Kylorans, who had once been stalwart allies, now seemed to withdraw into themselves, their psychic shields pulsing with anxiety. They had expected to be the architects of peace, not participants in a fight for survival. Their leaders exchanged tense glances, silently debating their next move. The Kyloran delegation, usually composed of philosophers and strategists, had been thrust into a situation they were ill-equipped to handle, a real battle with no room for negotiation. Falk's gaze swept over the chaos unfolding before her, her mind working at lightning speed. The spire's external defenses were down, its shields flickering on the verge of collapse. The explosive sabotage had crippled the station's power grid, leaving them vulnerable to the approaching Zul'kar warships. Falk's instinct screamed at her to act, but the situation was dire. She had no idea how long they could hold out before the Zul'kar launched their final assault. "Get the communication systems back online," Falk ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to send a distress signal to the nearest human fleet." But the response from the tech crew was not what she had hoped. "We're locked out of the systems. They've shut down the central hub," came the reply, filled with static. Falk clenched her fists. The Zul'kar weren't just attacking the spire, they were systematically disabling every means of defense and communication. It was a brutal tactic, designed to leave them isolated, with no allies to call for help. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a solution. The Kylorans, despite their psychic abilities, were not fighters. The Obrins, towering and majestic, had the physical strength to hold their own but lacked the technology to fight back effectively without proper coordination. The Krinther, with their insectoid intelligence, were still organizing their response. The alliances that had seemed so solid just hours ago now seemed like fragile threads that could snap at any moment. But Falk refused to accept defeat. Humans had been faced with impossible odds before. They had built their civilization from the ashes of war and chaos, and they had learned to thrive in the harshest conditions. Now was no different. The words of Earth's ancient leaders echoed in her mind. A house divided cannot stand. The galaxy, it seemed, had become a house divided. And if humanity was to survive, they would have to be the ones to rebuild it. Falk stepped forward, her voice rising above the chaos. "We may not have the fleet, the weapons, or the numbers, but we have something stronger, willpower," she declared. "The Zul'kar think they can intimidate us, but they have underestimated humanity. If we're going to survive this, we must stand together. We must fight no matter the cost." Her words reverberated across the room. There was a moment of stunned silence, as if the gravity of her message had hit everyone at once. Then, slowly, one by one, the delegates began to nod, their resolve hardening. The Kylorans, still skeptical, exchanged uncertain glances, but the others, the Krinther, the Obrinis, even the enigmatic Krix, began to rally behind her. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. The species that had once looked to the Kylorans for guidance now began to look to humanity, drawn to Falk's strength and determination. The Kylorans, despite their psychic power, seemed unable to sway the others. They had been led to believe that their mental abilities would be the key to peace. But in the face of true crisis, it was the human spirit, the unyielding resolve to survive, that proved to be the most powerful force of all. Even the Zul'kar warlord Arkath's shrine had underestimated humanity's determination. The air was thick with tension as their warships loomed just outside the spire, but Falk's call to arms had ignited something in the hearts of the other species. The fear that had paralyzed them only moments before was beginning to shift into something else, defiance. The question now was whether this fragile hope could be enough. Would they be able to stand against the overwhelming might of the Zul'kar, or would their unity collapse under the pressure? The answer, Falk knew, depended on the strength of their resolve and humanity's unwillingness to let fear dictate their fate. The tension in the Unity Spire had reached a boiling point. Every passing second felt like an eternity as the dark shadow of the approaching Zul'kar fleet loomed ever closer. The station's once pristine halls were now filled with frantic activity delegates and security officers, scrambling to prepare for what was almost certain to be an all-out assault. Falk, standing at the center of the chaos, could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. As the human representative, it was her words that had sparked a renewed sense of unity among the species, but now she could only watch as they rallied to her call. The Kylorans, though still hesitant, had agreed to join forces with the rest. Their psychic abilities might not be enough to stop the Zul'kar fleet, but together they might stand a chance. Yet everyone to their positions, Falk ordered firmly. She watched as the Krinther delegates, with their insectoid agility, darted through the crowd, organizing the defense forces. The Obrins, despite their towering size, worked quietly and efficiently, positioning their energy shields and tactical units. Even the Cricks, ever enigmatic and silent, floated calmly through the halls, their gelatinous forms adjusting the station's weakened communication arrays. Despite the fear that hung in the air like a thick fog, Falk couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The different species, all with their own struggles and differences, were coming together. Humanity had united them, and perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough. But even as she prepared for the defense of the spire, Falk knew that they were fighting against impossible odds. The Zul'kar fleet was massive, dozens of warships, each one bristling with advanced weaponry, had already broken through the station's outer defenses. There was no mistaking the intent behind their actions. They were not here to negotiate or demand reparations. They were here to dominate, to crush the fragile hope that had been growing among the galaxy's species. Then it came. The first strike. A sudden blast rocked the station, the force of it rattling the walls and sending sparks flying from the overhead lighting. The warning systems blared to life, but it was already too late. The Zul'kar had fired first, sending a barrage of energy missiles toward the heart of the spire. Falk's blood ran cold as the screen in front of her flashed with alarming readings. The outer shields were down, and the impact had torn through several key structural points. The station's core was exposed, vulnerable. The Kylorans, who had been meditating in preparation for battle, now rushed to assist the defensive systems. Their psychic powers swirled in the air, amplifying the station's remaining shields. But it was clear that it wouldn't be enough. The Zul'kar had been prepared for this. The warlord Kath's shrine had anticipated every move, every weakness in the spire's defenses. The first strike had been a calculated move, designed to destabilize and disorient the station's inhabitants. And it had worked. The energy pulse had thrown the station into chaos, sending systems offline and leaving them unable to respond with the full force of their combined fleets. "Prepare for impact," Falk muttered under her breath. She turned to the gathered delegates, her voice unwavering despite the panic that had taken hold of the room. "We need to hold them off. This is the moment we stand together." Her words were like a spark in dry tinder. The Kylorans reached out with their psychic powers, sending waves of mental force to reinforce the station's shields. The Krinther coordinated their efforts with precision, launching countermeasures from their makeshift battlements. The Obrins worked feverishly to repair damaged systems, their massive hands deftly manipulating the station's core mechanisms. The Zul'kar responded with another volley. This time, the blast hit closer to the central core, shaking the very foundations of the spire. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. Then, the emergency systems kicked in, casting the room in an eerie red glow. The explosion had damaged the station's critical systems even further, and Falk could feel the floor beneath her feet tremble as the spire's hull groaned under the pressure. Despite the damage, Falk knew they couldn't afford to give up. Humanity had faced worse odds before, and every instinct told her that this was not the time to yield. The Zul'kar fleet was not just a military force. It was a message. They wanted to show the galaxy that no species was safe under their rule. But what Kath's shrine had failed to account for was the unbreakable will of those who refused to be cowed. Humanity, together with their allies, would fight not just for survival, but for the future of the galaxy. But as the second volley of energy blasts surged toward them, Falk knew this was only the beginning. The real test was about to come, and whether they would survive or be wiped out would depend on how far they were willing to go to fight for peace. The second volley from the Zul'kar warship struck the Unity Spire with the fury of 1,000 storms. The shockwaves reverberated through the station, tearing through walls and causing the very metal beneath their feet to groan in protest. Falk stumbled, gripping the console before her to steady herself. Sparks flew overhead as the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in a sinister red glow. The station's hull was weakening, and every second that passed brought them closer to total collapse. But amid the devastation, something unexpected began to happen. The fear that had once paralyzed the delegates, the panic that had consumed their thoughts began to shift. Slowly, the various species that had been caught in the chaos started to find their footing. The Kylorans, their psychic powers pushing against the mental strain of the assault, stood tall, their focus unbroken. The Obrins, towering with their stoic resilience, began to form an impenetrable defense around the central core, their energy shields shimmering as they absorbed the barrage. The Krinther, with their multifaceted minds, coordinated the countermeasures, activating automated turrets and defense drones that fired back with a precision Falk hadn't seen in any of the previous battles. Humanity, though small in numbers compared to the other species, was not to be underestimated. Falk knew the power of determination. She had seen it in her people before. It was the very essence of what made humans different. They had been forged in the fires of adversity, their spirit tested time and time again. They would not bend. Not now. Not ever. Focus on the weak points, Falk commanded, her voice cutting through the din of alarms and sirens. We may not have the firepower to match their fleet, but we know how to exploit vulnerabilities. We've done it before. The Kylorans, always measured and strategic, responded almost immediately, their psychic abilities honing in on the Spire's failing systems. They began to communicate silently, directing their combined willpower toward reactivating the station's damaged weapons systems. Psychic threads extended like invisible tendrils, weaving around the shattered machinery and pulling it back into a semblance of functionality. The Obrins, though slower to react, quickly adapted to the plan, providing the brute force needed to stabilize the station's energy flow. As the station groaned and shuddered, Falk couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Despite everything, the sabotage, the ambush, the devastating First Striker allies were rallying. They were fighting back. Together they stood a chance. But the clock was ticking. Each explosion brought them closer to losing everything. The Zul'kar had no intention of letting the Spire survive this attack. Every shot from their warships was calculated, each one tearing into the station's vulnerable infrastructure. They wanted to send a message. No one can oppose the Zul'kar Empire. Falk's mind raced as she pieced together the information coming in from every channel. The warlord Arkath's shrine was not just attacking to cripple their forces, he was trying to eliminate the very foundation of the peace talks. The Unity Spire, the symbol of their fragile hope, was the target. If it fell, the entire galaxy would be thrust back into a state of chaos. The Zul'kar would assert dominance, and no alliance could ever challenge them again. Redirect all available power to the remaining weapon systems, Falk shouted, her resolve hardening. The station's power grid, though failing, still held a modicum of charge. We need to send a message of our own. As the Krinther and Obrins worked to restore the weapon systems, the Kylorans intensified their psychic effort, creating a force field that stretched across the station like a protective barrier. Their combined mental strength stabilized the weakening shields, allowing the remaining defense systems to fire with renewed vigor. The first retaliatory strike from the station's cannon sent a brilliant pulse of energy lancing out toward the Zul'kar fleet. The blast wasn't enough to destroy the warships, but it caught them off guard. The Zul'kar warlord's fleet hesitated for a split second. It was all the time Falk needed. She knew this was their moment, however brief. Now, she barked. All ships, all defenses, push them back. The allied species, despite their differences, launched their counterattack in perfect synchronization. The Obrins activated their shields in unison, deflecting incoming fire while the Krinther coordinated missile launches, aimed at the weak points on the Zul'kar warships. The Kylorans, channeling their psychic might into focused bursts of mental energy, interfered with the Zul'kar communications, causing confusion and disarray among their ranks. For the first time since the attack began, the tide seemed to turn. The Zul'kar warships faltered, their once unshakable resolve showing cracks. Falk could see the disarray in their movements on the tactical displays. The Zul'kar were not used to this level of resistance. The unity and resolve of the allied forces had caught them off guard. But Falk knew they couldn't let up. This was just the beginning of the fight. The stakes had never been higher, and the cost of failure was unimaginable. The question remained, could this fragile alliance hold long enough to push back the overwhelming might of the Zul'kar Empire? The next strike would come soon, and Falk had to be ready. The Unity Spire was a broken shell of its former self. The once magnificent structure, a beacon of hope and diplomacy, now flickered in the dim emergency lights, its hull scarred by blast after blast from the Zul'kar fleet. Falk's mind raced as she moved through the shattered corridors, trying to maintain her focus despite the chaos. The Spire's systems were barely holding together, and the warships outside were regrouping, preparing for their next devastating attack. The first counterstrike had shown the Zul'kar that their intended prey was not as helpless as they had assumed, but it was only a momentary victory. The Allied forces' humans, Kylorans, Krinther, Obrins had fought valiantly, but the Zul'kar had the numbers, the firepower, and the ruthlessness to keep pushing forward. Falk's eyes were drawn to the monitors flashing around her, showing the exact gravity of the situation. The spire's internal structural integrity was rapidly deteriorating. The Kylorans had managed to stabilize the station's shields for a time, but those shields were now down in power. The Krinther had diverted all their resources into repairing the damaged weapon systems, but they were working against the clock. The Zul'kar would be back soon, and this time they wouldn't hesitate. A crackling voice came through the comms, cutting through the frantic noise. It was Lieutenant Kale, the station's chief engineer, her voice strained but resolute. "The main reactor is unstable, Falk. We can't keep this up much longer. If the shields fail completely, we'll have no choice but to abandon ship." Falk's heart skipped a beat at the grim news. Abandoning the spire meant surrender, something she couldn't allow. If they fled, the Zul'kar would have won. Not just this battle, but the war. Every species in the galaxy would fall under their oppressive rule, and humanity's dream of lasting peace would be extinguished forever. She didn't have time to waste. She had to act. "Understood," Falk replied, her voice unwavering. "We hold this station, no matter what." Her eyes darted to the various species stationed around the central command room. The Kylorans were still focused, their psychic abilities working in tandem with the Obrins to keep the shields intact. The Krinther were manning the control consoles, desperately trying to revive the station's weapon systems. And the humans, her people, were standing strong, ready to give everything they had. They had already been pushed to their limits, but they still believed in one thing: survival. The Zul'kar fleet was regrouping, preparing for the final assault. Falk could feel the weight of their impending attack, the pressure of their overwhelming power pressing in from all sides. The warlord Arkath's shrine was not one to retreat or show mercy. He would come for them again, and this time he would be ready to finish what he had started. As the minutes ticked by, Falk's thoughts turned to the last card she had to play: the station's experimental long-range weapon. The Krinther had been working on it in secret, a massive energy cannon capable of piercing the armor of even the most formidable warships. It was still untested, but Falk knew that they didn't have the luxury of hesitation. If there was any hope of turning the tide, this weapon would be it. "Kale," Falk said, turning to the chief engineer, "how much power is needed to fire the experimental cannon?" Kale's face was pale, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's a massive drain on the station's core. If we do this, it may cause a critical failure. But it's our best shot." Falk knew the risks. Firing the cannon could destroy the spire, but it could also destroy the Zul'kar warships. It was a gamble, one that they couldn't afford to lose. "Prepare the cannon," Falk ordered. "We'll make it count." The room went silent as everyone turned their attention to the control panels. The Krinther worked feverishly, inputting commands, while the Kylorans focused their psychic powers on funneling energy into the weapon's core. The Obrins were busy reinforcing the station's failing structure, knowing that once the cannon was fired, the spire might not survive. Outside, the Zul'kar fleet was drawing closer, their warships ominous against the backdrop of the vast, starry expanse. Falk could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the seconds dragged on. "We're ready," Kale's voice came through the comms, shaky but determined. The chamber was silent. Every eye was on the main console, waiting for the signal to fire. Falk's finger hovered over the command button. The pressure of it was suffocating. She made her choice. "Fire!" The energy cannon roared to life, sending a blinding pulse of concentrated fire into the heart of the Zul'kar fleet. The blast split the darkness of space, racing toward the lead warship. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The Zul'kar ship was obliterated in a burst of fire and debris, the shockwave sending ripples through the surrounding fleet. The other warships hesitated for just a moment, their commanders scrambling to assess the damage. But Falk knew this was only a temporary victory. They had bought themselves time, but the battle was far from over. The spire was still on the edge of collapse, and the Zul'kar would not let this setback go unpunished. The final stand had just begun, and the fate of the galaxy still hung in the balance. Thank you for joining us on Starlight Sci-Fi. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more thrilling tales of humanity's place in the stars. Until next time, keep looking up.